tell you when we're good.
Okay.
We're live.
Okay. Today I am talking about kind of two things based around this paper, the Sparse Manifold Transform from Yubei Chen, Dylan Payton, and Bruno Olshausen. So it's from the Redwood Center. And
What year is the paper?
Last year.
Is it 2019 or 2018?
2018. The paper came out for NeurIPS. The first place I saw it presented was at the Simons Institute, the same place you presented in that class, I think April. Yeah, it would have been April. Now I am presenting this as if you haven't seen it before, but I'm not presenting all of it. I'm presenting the parts that seem especially relevant to us. And so I'll briefly say like the view of the cortex postulated in this paper, but mostly I'm going to stay at, it gets a little bit into hierarchy, and I'm kind of leaving that out of this for the most part. I'm just focusing on a single column. So just to start this off, and what was thought-provoking to me and what made me want to really understand this paper was, once I understood it somewhat well, I realized that this diagram that I've drawn here of sensory input coming in, being mapped to a sparse code, and then which is then mapped to another representation that is kind of a point in a metric space, a Euclidean representation, a grid cell representation, some point in some space where like distances, where directions are meaningful. This picture that I've drawn here, if you ignore the green, we can talk about the green in a second. This picture is one way of describing our model, or a part of our model, and it's also a way of describing what this paper postulates, in just the way I've drawn it here. Our approach is more prescriptive about what this metric space is. It's that it's locations, physical locations in actual space,
Well, that's true when we talk about object modeling, but it's not true in general.
And that's what I was thinking is we start there and then we want to broaden it and generalize it to. We want to broaden it and reuse that for other types of learning. And
I'm writing this morning and yesterday afternoon. I'm writing about this very topic in the book, so it's fresh on my mind.
So I would say they're coming in from another direction where they want to kind of do an unsupervised learn some metric space without really hard coding anything, without really saying it's going to be location, it's going to be. They don't even. We're focused on sensory motor, on taking movement and using that to figure out these dimensions. They're more focused on just arbitrary. What are the dimensions? Like, I'll jump ahead just briefly. Like another example of a dimension would be stapler configuration. How open the stapler is. Other things that change in the world.
That's considered a dimension, or could you consider that a state? I mean, you could argue, as we wrote in our papers, that the stapler opening works in the same dimensional space. It's just different points in that space. And I wouldn't have called it different dimensions of that space. Am I making too much of a distinction here?
Let's see. Maybe there's.
I can define a three-dimensional grid around a stapler. That space could be unchanging as the stapler moves. It's just that parts of the stapler are at different points in that space at any point in time. But the space itself, the metric space itself, hasn't changed. The open stapler is not a new dimension in that space. It's just the current state of the stapler has a different configuration in that space. So that's why we've described it that way. I'm wondering if this is a different idea, that that's a different dimension of the space. You follow what I'm saying?
I think our best way forward is for me to come back to the stapler later.
Okay.
Once I've shown another example. It was what came up off the top of my head there. But the idea of there being these other dimensions other than spatial location and learning them in an unsupervised way. Learning the dimensions that are out there, putting your knowledge into some sort of metric space, which to me is.
That is our theory. We just, instead of starting there, we said, let's first understand it in a physical space. That has, but in the general principles, if you're going to have a cortical column being a cortical column, then it has to discover the metric space, which is really just a function of what you sense and how it changes as you move.
Yeah.
And it turns out when you're sensing something physical and you're moving physical, that it might be a three-dimensional space. But if you're sensing something that about democracy, and you create your own space for that, and those spaces can be different for different people. So I don't think we're tied to. We're definitely not tied to a hard-coded space. It's just that's the easiest place to start. I just want to make that distinction. I don't think we've ever really said we're. To me, the theory's always been generic space.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's useful before I dive into theirs to do a quick review of I've written metric spaces in the brain from the perspective of grid cells and what types of things we know that grid cells seem to represent. There's the classic example. I'm going to spend 2 seconds on this. Grid cells. It's the seminal paper of rats moving around represents physical location. That's like the well-known one. But now to talk about other kind of more generic spaces that grid cells represent. In this paper from Ben Krause, Mike Hasselmo, Howard Akimo, grid cells seem to be tracking elapsed time. If a rat knows that it needs to go to a place and wait for some amount of time to pass, it almost seems like what is suggested by the neural recordings is that the grid cells seem to be updating and keeping track of how much time has elapsed.
So like a space-time.
Yeah. Yes.
Coding.
Yes. I've oversimplified this paper significantly just now with what I said, but we're going to spend the next 5 minutes talking about it if I go into more detail.
Yeah, that's a fascinating topic that we've never really discussed here much, and I'd love to go into that one.
Okay. Whether it should happen now.
Oh, okay.
We
can leave it for another time. I'm just saying that's
okay.
a really interesting problem. Is time represented doing the exact same mechanisms, or is it really sort of an alternate mechanism that's combined with grid cells?
I'll say a little bit more here because there is something here that's more. So the grid cells are. Okay. We're going to get into this a little bit. What the rat is doing, here is its task is running in this figure 8 kind of hallway, and in the middle there's this is a bad drawing of a treadmill, of an actual treadmill. Often in neuroscience experiments they call something a treadmill when an animal's running on a wheel and spinning it like a hamster wheel. But this is an actual treadmill where it's like almost like a machine that's running under it. What the rat does is it runs around this figure 8, it gets here, there's a barrier here. It can't advance. It has to run on a treadmill. And the treadmill moves at varying speeds. Sometimes it's fast, sometimes it's slow. But in many of the experiments, this barrier is in the way for a fixed amount of time. I told you this was going to involve getting into it. So where I'm going with this is some grid cells, presumably some grid cell modules, track how much time the rat has been on the treadmill. Some track how much distance it has run on the treadmill. And others track some weird projection of the two, some weird combination where the time elapsed causes the bump to move in a certain direction, and the distance elapsed causes the bump to move in another direction. As if the rat is representing some projection in the space of all the relevant variables, where one variable is time elapsed, one variable is distance elapsed.
Good.
And so the principle here is that grid cells are representing some projection. Path integration is screwing with things. There are possible other explanations. This is a little messy, but it's possibly suggestive of all of that. This is going to be more familiar to a lot of people in the room. Grid cells in humans representing this space of possible birds. As a person is looking at various birds or navigating bird space with different neck lengths and different leg lengths. There are signatures of grid cell firing representing where the person is in bird space as they navigate through these different types of birds. And then another one from David Tink's lab involves a rat is, here I'm showing a rat with its arm on a lever that it's pulling this lever down. And its task that it has learned is here's a rising pitch, like, a pitch is rising, and at a certain point the rat has to release the lever at a certain pitch. And they find that the grid cells now start learning locations in the pitch space. At different pitches, different grid cells are responding. This has been just me throwing one thing after another at you of grid cells representing some weird combination of variables involving time, involving location, involving lots of things. I just wanted to set the ground, set a foundation that.
Well, it's not clear to me that time is a metric space.
Yeah.
In the way they think about, physical space as a metric space. We don't need to discuss this further, but that's an interesting question. It's the dichotomy of time and space in physics too. It's not quite the same, but it seems like it's the same. Anyway, so I think that's an interesting question to talk about sometime.
Yeah.
It's not clear that is a metric space.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. With all that put in place, I'm going to talk about this paper a little bit. And first, I'm just So that section was metric spaces via grid cells. Now I'm going to talk about metric spaces in the ventral visual stream according to this model, according to this theory, according to this paper, the Sparse Manifold Transform. And first I want to just first I'm just going to start with traditional Bruno sparse coding, and then show what the next step they've taken. So to illustrate this whole model, I'm gonna start with a hand-coded example, and then later I'm gonna talk about how it's learned. But just to show you, I'll just dive right into it. You'll pick it up as we go. So suppose V1 senses the world using a set of Gabor filters. It senses. Here's a picture of a cortical column. Here's the visual patch that feeds into it, and say the set of things that the set of kind of filters it puts down on its input are Gabor filters at different positions in this visual patch, different sizes, scale, and different orientations. As an aside, here I'm using words like scale and orientation. Don't let that overlap with the use of those words in grid cells. It's just the word to describe this Gabor filter. So in this, if we were to like hand tune V1 to just assume its input, assume what it should represent is the input according to these Gabor filters, then the set of possible things that it ever represents occupies this four-dimensional metric space. This four-dimensional, it's the manifold of possible things that get represented, and the four dimensions are: where is the filter, where is the center of this Gabor filter, how big is it, and how is it rotated. Now, from the perspective, now in this language here, I haven't really said anything yet. I'm just laying out, like, take this view of the world, take this view of what V1's doing. In this language, what the sparse filters, what Bruno's kind of classic work does is it takes this four-dimensional space and randomly or uniformly distributes a set of units throughout that space, where one unit responds to this specific filter, and that might be like this one right here, and another one responds to it shifted to the side, and that might be this one here. And I've drawn this sort of schematically. I've drawn it two-dimensional because you can't draw a four-dimensional shape. And under this view, these units, the units are uniformly distributed through this manifold. keep in mind I haven't presented anything new yet. I'm putting a narrative on what's already there, and any stimulus is then represented as like a sparse code of these. And okay, this is a point of view on sparse coding. The next step they take, finally the new thing, is they want to represent this metric space explicitly. They want a population that is actually, rather than being just like a bunch of coordinates, like how close is the stimulus to this cell, how close is it to this cell. They want to represent it in a way where they're actually capturing this 2D space or this 4D space. So they assign a second population of cells to do this.
To do what?
To represent a point in a 2D space or a 4D space.
I don't quite
And
understand that. You represented the input by taking a bunch of inputs. In our world, we'd say you run it through the spatial pool, or you end up with a bunch of units that are active. What's the other representation you need? I'm missing that. I mean, in the brain they're laid out in 2D, but that's just an artifact of the brain. What I'm missing. What the next?
Okay.
What are they trying to achieve in the next step?
There's nothing here significant about 2D. Only that I know how to draw 2D.
Yeah,
that's why 2D is there.
Fine. So it's collapsing the 2D space. So
yeah.
That's not important, right?
Right. Now the.
Or maybe arguing it is important because in the brain those are mutually exclusive adjacent columns and we collapse a multidimensional space onto them or something.
Yeah, I'm not making a statement about that. Maybe I think the best way forward might be to say like.
You're saying the second population is the metric space itself?
Yes.
Like grid cells?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So this is like our output of our spatial pool, or the output, these are like place cells or something like that, and now you need a metric space.
Yeah.
Okay. That's just okay. That's basic. Okay.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
What's the right order for this? I'll go ahead and say this next bullet point. Then I'll talk about how we would do this with grid cells and how they do it a little differently. The second point they make, a second thing they do is they allow multiple simultaneous active locations or points in this metric space.
This is your green dots on the upper right
Yes.
there. We do that too, right? We take an input, it could be in multiple places.
But theirs is different.
Okay.
So we do that to represent ambiguity.
Yeah.
They do it to represent, for example, you see a shape. I just drew a random shape here. This isn't meaningful. It consists of 3 edges. They represent that using 3 simultaneous locations, 3 simultaneous points. This has an analog. I have made a case for this.
I don't know what that means.
Okay,
Is that the same as when we think about a compositional object?
Yeah.
That these are little subcomponents and they're arranged.
So each cell can't represent a location. That's insufficient to represent a location, right?
Right. Correct.
So is that 3 populations of cells?
So the way I'll go into how they do it in a second. What Subhajay said is exactly right. How I've argued in the past that a conversation we've had in the past is, for example, how do you represent a coffee cup as a compositional object where you have a handle and a cylinder? I've pointed out that maybe you have that one way to do that is to activate a union of the location of the handle and the location of the cylinder, and using those types of unions to represent compositional objects.
Yeah, and I've argued that's a good temporary solution, but not a good long-term solution.
Okay. Yes.
So you can't learn the object that way. You can just temporarily construct the object that way.
So this is the kind of the spirit for where they're using these multiple points as if you want to represent an image as a set of edges, that they treat that as multiple.
I mean, I don't know if this is the same thing, but the way I would think about it is that if we're talking about V1 and these are 3 different columns that are representing the 3 different edges, each one of those not many columns, but bigger columns, each one of those columns has its own location in a space of the larger object. But they're not sharing the metric space. They're all representing the same metric space, but they have their own different representations. So I would think about that as like, oh, this column over here knows there's something at this location in the space, and this column over here knows something at this location in the space, and this column over here knows something at a different location in space, but it's not the same
Right.
It's not the same cells representing the space.
Right.
There's three different metric spaces. Is that what they're saying here?
The same population of cells is representing.
Okay, that's different.
The
then.
same
we would
visual
have three different populations of cells. If we think about a macro column, right? Each one has its.
I guess I'm okay. One way we would do this we'd have this array of grid cell modules, and I'm just doing the trick of activating multiple bumps in each module. That's what I mean when I say a single population represents all three at the same time. So this is a big population. All of the grid cell modules in a single cortical column.
That would be then that under this. So those grid cell modules are the way we use grid cell modules to make a unique point. Was that right? So that would be a union, then, right? That's a union of 3 points.
Yes, but used not to represent ambiguity, but rather to represent.
Okay. Well, it's representing 3 points.
Yeah.
In the same space. Using the same population of cells. Okay.
Yeah. So I drew this to show conceptually how we would do what they're doing. But they do something that's interesting and thought-provoking and might actually has a 50-50 chance of being like really good, really insightful for us. So.
Oh, you think that's how we would do the same equivalent to what they're
yes,
proposing?
this is using our doing
okay.
the
if
trivial.
we were to do it,
yeah.
the way we've described doing this as a
Yeah.
union, this is not what they're trying to do, but we would have done it that way. We
Yeah.
have 4 grid cell modules, each one has multiple bumps.
Yeah.
Which we know is a problematic
Yeah.
thing. We don't really think it works like that anymore.
Right. So they do want to do this conceptually, but probably don't want to do it like this. Who knows? But I'll say what they do is they use a population code. They use a set of neurons. Yeah, they use a population code where each one. Okay, what's the right way to say this? I'll put this in like Fourier terms, where if you want to, it's almost like they treat this as an image that they want to describe using some basis, where the basis vectors are these individual. This is a basis for describing sets of points. If you almost treat this as an image, and yeah, they do that, and when they learn these, when they use their learning rule, the types of filters, the types of coordinates, it's like each of these units responds to certain locations in this Euclidean space, locations in this metric space. And one of them will respond kind of to central ones. Another one will respond kind of like yes over here, no down here. Another one will be kind of they become more honestly grid-like. They become something like this. And what I find interesting when I look at this is if you were to record cells that look a lot like this, as the represented location moves around 2D space, it would look a whole lot like grid cells. And part of me wonders if, I'm half wondering if grid cells are actually participating in this kind of code.
So this is in some sense an alternate or a proposal of how grid cells might come about.
Yeah.
Right.
And what?
Like, so
yeah.
The world has observed, the 2D bumps moving around, and no one really knows how they're created, and we don't know how they represent unique points in space, right? And this is perhaps an alternate thought about how they come about. Is that right?
That's half of it, but the other part is that okay, background. Grid cells and entorhinal cortex, they project up into the hippocampus, and about 25% of the cells that project up to the hippocampus are grid cells. Other ones are these other spatially tuned cells that respond to particular locations, but they don't have this clean grid firing pattern. And so the other side of this is that yes, it shows how grid cells come about, but it also shows how they work together with the other nearby cells that aren't exactly grids. They're something else that have other fields.
So would it be proper to say that the classic grid cell is just one of the basis functions of space?
Yeah.
And that there are other ones that kind of look funky, but we don't really know what they are. There are these other things over here. There are different basis functions that could work under different ways.
Yes. And an interesting possibility from all this is, conceptually, all of us have kind of been right. It is representing a location in some metric space. But maybe another thing that comes along, the reason why they needed all of these various basis functions is because they wanted to be able to represent multiple points simultaneously. They wouldn't have had a need for that if they only had to represent one point at a time. And so it may be the case that even entorhinal cortex is actually representing multiple points at the same time, using individual bumps, using single, like the traditional grid cells will still only have one, it won't have multiple bumps. But the thing that if you were to somehow decode it into what it's representing in the metric space, it actually might be representing
So
multiple
in some
bumps.
sense, these basis functions are metric. Each one has a single bump, and each one can be updated by a movement command, let's say.
Yeah.
Right, so in each one, a metric in the sense you could, in theory, calculate how far you have to go to get to some bump or something like that. And then, I mean, this is a question. Then you're saying if I take the sum of all these, or the projection of all these, or something like that, I end up with this mishmash of cells we actually see, which are actually encoding multiple points at the same time. And that representation up there on its own really isn't metric. I can't give a motor command to it and have it update properly, right? I get the motor
Which one
command
up here,
the collection, the circle with the three dots. These guys in the bottom here, the basis functions have a single point. I can give a motor command and they update. But now I'm combining them somehow to create what these other cells in the circle with the three dots there. That on its own, I can't just feed a motor command into. I have to feed it into the basis functions. That's a reflection that's an encoding of this space with multiple things active at once. But it's not, itself is not metric. I couldn't look at that and take two representations and figure how far apart they are. I'd have to look at these guys.
I want you to be right, but I don't know yet.
Well, it seems sort of it's inevitable.
I want something like that to be true, but I haven't. The last night, this is what I was thinking about, but I haven't worked through it all yet.
Okay.
Could I?
Yeah.
So if each of those, I'll call them features, for lack of a better term, each of those features project to, in this example, a common location, and then there's multiple sets of these things. It's replicated over multiple locations in this metric space. Is that what you're saying? There's a grid of these, and each one of them has an array of these features that they can fire
So
on.
when you're saying features, are you talking about these things down here?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm trying to figure out what those receptive fields project to with respect to the metric space you're talking about.
The receptive fields project too.
What do they see?
Yeah, well, what are those things?
These down here.
Yeah.
So
What is one?
this is the second population in the model. Basically, so I'll step back and say, in this Sparse Manifold Transform paper, they're proposing a second population of cells. So they start with the sparse code that comes from the traditional sparse coding, and then now they want to take it and represent it in kind of a more metric way.
Are they
And-
representing it in a metric way, or
What
are
does
they?
that mean?
I mean, in our world, we pair. That's
It's,
like.
I'm speaking multiple languages here. I'm saying metric because in some ways I'm presenting to Jeff. I could also say an embedding. I could also say putting it into a Euclidean space.
Well, Euclidean spaces.
Doesn't,
Yeah.
so if you do the traditional sparse coding, you get a bunch of features, like gabors at different scales and
Yeah.
orientations and all of
Yeah.
that. So that's a space that could represent any object.
Yeah.
And you could do unions in that space too, presumably.
But that's not a metric space, because you can't, it's sensory driven. And so
Yeah.
I can't, if I'm looking at some point of an object and another point of an object, what I'm sensing at those points can't tell me anything about how far apart they are and how to get from one to the other.
Yes, I'm trying to understand in what is the construction of this metric
Here.
space. I don't understand.
I
how it's
should
created.
say another way I could describe it is this is the sparse coded representation is a high dimensional sparse code. This is a low dimensional non-sparse code. Low dimensional where its goal is now to be, I'll keep saying metric. It is an embedding. It is Euclidean. So part of the answer
What
is.
does that mean? That doesn't mean anything to me.
What part doesn't mean anything to you?
Like if you change anything about the sensory stimulus, does this other encoding change?
It should.
If you change something about the
If
stimulus,
it's in our pure location code, it's completely devoid of the sensory information. You can talk about the location in the abstract. It's a completely separate space.
no, it is mapping out this space of variables that cause the input to change. So yes, if you change the stimulus,
That will change too.
Yes.
It's not a pure location code.
it's not associating.
So I'm trying to figure out what is the difference. Is it just a random projection from one to another, or is there a difference?
It's not a random projection. So what they want is as this stimulus changes. Okay, here I'll jump into the final section because this is what I'm about to say. Here I was laying out like the logic of what V1 could do in a cartoon version where all it's doing is Gabor filters that are rotated and shifted and scaled. Now I'm going to say what they want what properties they want this metric space to have, this Euclidean space to have, is so beyond hand coding.
What was hand coded?
The fact that I'm just assuming.
Why does that have to be hand? Can't we just assume it's learned?
Yeah.
I hand coded it right here on the whiteboard.
Okay, but it's not just hand coded. To me, I looked at this as what's observed. This is,
okay, yeah.
This
yeah,
is a description of what was learned.
Yes,
I mean,
fine, but I feel like I'm still very rigid about saying these are the 4 dimensions represented in V1.
Well,
but
okay,
what
but
is the
that's-
principle
but
that
that's
will learn
just-
this and other things?
Yeah, we can just say that was learned and this is what's observed.
Yeah, okay.
That's the pure sparse code.
That's the pure sparse.
If you run this,
When you say pure sparse code, like Bruno's sparse coding,
Yeah.
okay, sure. And okay, now the principle they want, how this metric space gets learned, and what properties it has. So as your input changes over time, the green dots, or the black dots, also changes over time. They shift around as the Gabor filter moves around, rotates, gets larger. Those dots move around as well. The learning objective they have is they want those paths over short time scales to tend to be straight and smooth. They should be straight lines. They should update at constant rates. They should tend to, and they should be.
As I move, or is that what you're saying?
Yeah, as the
eye moves or something like that, or I'm looking at one.
Oh, I see. It's a general principle of even if you're just watching, I shouldn't use the stapler example. If you're watching a person,
the stapler,
okay, I can, but I feel like I might run into some.
Okay.
So if you're watching like a cartoon stapler just opening and closing, that should cause, that's one example. This is kind of a crazy example. I should have maybe started with something easier. Like as something moves across your visual field, it should tend to cause, or when I say visual field, across the visual patch that this cortical column is receiving input from. It should tend to cause the bump to move in a straight line. The point in the metric space should move in a straight line. As it rotates, it should move in a straight line.
This seems to me the idea of this definition of a metric space is very different than what we're proposing, right?
It doesn't take any motor input currently.
Yeah,
They don't use
it's not really a metric space. It's to call it smooth. This doesn't make it a metric space. To me, a metric space is like, you know, you use the example of a map of the town, like a grid cell. And I know my location in the town. Well, a metric space says, oh, give them 2 points, I can tell you how far apart they are. Give them 2 points, I can tell you how to get from one point to the other point, even if I've never gone that way before, right? So I may walk from here to the library, and I know where I am to the library, I know where I am to the Starbucks, but I'm at the library, I can figure out how to get to those Starbucks, even though I've never done that before. That's because there's this regular structure to the space, and that movements have the same effect everywhere, that kind of stuff. So to me, that's a metric space, and it's not just that when I move in some direction, it's smooth. That's not the key property, it seems to me. So the fact that I can have the same input changing over time, unless you're encoding time, maybe, I guess.
Are those 4 dimensions you drew out there, is that the metric space they're uncovering?
4 dimensions? Yes, that would be.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I thought that was, so there's.
That's not a metric space, that's a space of inputs.
But
So every input will have one of those, 1 point, can be represented by 1 point in that space.
yeah,
And so given all these inputs, they're trying to learn what those 4 dimensions are. Is that
Yeah. Yeah.
You can have a generative model where you take those 4 numbers and create a visual patch. And they're learning kind of the inverse of that.
I think, yeah, that's, yeah.
So it's kind of like the Huff transform kind of thing where that's kind of pose space, if you will, or parameter space. And they're just learning the inverse from.
Are you saying that what they're
That's true.
showing is how to take this 4-dimensional space and map it into a representation that's...
No, they're saying that there's some underlying set of changes that lead to this image patch. Let's say it's
Yeah.
4 dimensions, which we don't know what they are, these position, scale, orientation.
Yeah.
And there's a given an image patch, what are those 4 numbers?
Yeah.
And they're representing it in something that could have been represented with grid cells or.
But again, you're still representing the sensory input. You're not really representing its location anywhere. You're just, if I understand what you said, I'm just representing this input in a way that has certain properties. But it's nothing at all like the concept we have of location of in the world someplace.
It's a location in a like a parameter space. or
Okay, fine, but
configuration.
that's not
Or
the
like-
location
it's like the
of,
stretchy
that's not where
birthday.
the stretch of the handle is on the cup or something like that. It has to work for physical objects too, right? So
Yeah.
it has to map on the physical objects. But that can't tell me, if I understand what you said, that can't tell me where the handle is on the cup. It just says, here's how I represent the handle.
This will work with physical objects.
No, but it won't tell me where it is on the physical object. I need to be able to say there's some sort of reference frame around this object, and I now be able to locate things relative to it.
What I've described here is kind of a superset of what we're doing. Like good.
I don't see
Right.
how it can work. I mean, the concept. Let's not talk about a physical object. I need to be able to say. I don't. There has to be sort of this existing metric space that has all the properties I want, the ones I just talked about, before I've even populated it, before I've even said what's in it, right? Because I may find there's something at some location or may not. And so I start with a map of the town, and I haven't explored that part of the town yet, but the locations are out there. They're going to be the same locations when I get there. It doesn't matter. It's going to be the same location. I might find a library, I might find a coffee shop, but that location doesn't change based on what I find there. It's still the same location on the map. It seems like this doesn't have that property.
It does. So let's say what I'm drawing here is what will I sense as this Gabor filter is shifted to be centered here or here or here. So let's say this is the visual.
But that's not the physical space I was just talking about, the space in the world, right? That's a space of the sensory input.
So as I move left and right,
Yeah.
this this stimulus is going to move to other. I'm going to sense different things. I already know how I'm going to represent it. I'm going to represent it as this point in this metric space and this point in this metric space.
Again, we're talking using the word metric space. I keep thinking that we're not talking about the same thing. It's a metric space with the dimensions of those things.
Of the visual patch, right? Instead of
It's not the physical location in a world, which it has to be able to correspond to that at some point in some column. Not every column, but some columns have to be right. So it seems to me that's the metric space of position, scale, orientation, whatever. Is that right?
So what I was just saying was I was using your example of like say I am. Okay, the new axes I'm going to draw here are finger X, the X position of my finger, and the Y of
Relative
finger.
to what? Relative to the coffee cup?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, fine.
And I'm saying that as I move around, a visual depiction. I already know that when I move my finger down and to the right, we'll say coffee cup handle, as I move my finger to here, I already know how to update this code. I already know that I'm gonna do this.
Yeah.
And so I already know what this code's gonna be. And so that's how.
Yeah, but it doesn't tell you that code in our parlance is completely independent of what this finger senses at that
Correct.
position. So that's the thing I keep trying to understand. We separate out the encoding of the sensory input from the encoding of the location. And the encoding of the location can't be inherently derived or driven by what you sense. It's an associative learning that occurs there. But but here you said there's no sense of movement or location. I thought you were saying you said earlier that the actual location code is going to be dependent on what I sense. This just says the location code is depending on how I move. That location code is saying it's depending on what I sense. It has nothing to do with how I move.
So all of these locations, all these combinations of where I put these scroll bar things are mapped to some sensory input that is learned. That mapping has to be learned.
Yeah, but the whole point is you need the location space to exist independent of the learning.
And it does.
Well, I don't see it. If it's driven from these inputs, if it has anything to do with the position, scale, and orientation, then it's not independent of what was sensed, because I could sense something completely different at the same location. And I'm missing something basic here. It just seems like you have to completely separate out what's sensed from your location. They have to be two orthogonal things, which then are associated with learn. But
yeah, and that's what this is doing. They're being associatively learned. The system didn't know a priori what it was going to sense when these bars are configured differently.
But let me go back again. You said that the representation of location is going to be dependent on what's sensed. That can't be true.
No.
But you said that, so maybe I misunderstood.
Those mappings have to be learned. There exists a 4D metric space, a 2D metric space. If moving a finger around, that'd be 2D or 3D, depending how you look at it. And that space exists already. And learning consists of deciding which sensory patterns to associate with each of those points in that metric space.
So that's our view.
Yeah.
But I could swear you were saying that's not what they're talking about here.
If I could.
Because what difference does it make? Why do I even care about this manifold of position, scale, and orientation? It's irrelevant to the location.
I don't know. Why is it represented all over the place? Why are multiple variables being mapped into some Euclidean space? I'm trying to understand that.
Well, the assumption there is that those associates, like the bird things, that was learned. That was the assumption there. At least my assumption that was learned. It wasn't an a priori mapping that just came out of birds. If the birds change differently, then you would have a different mapping. So I guess I'm just trying to get the fundamental concept here, and I'm lost now. I'm as to what it is that they've.
So they're learning how to project each of these filters, each of these sparse codes into a metric space, and it's learned.
Right. The
Like
learning,
the space
learning
exists
between the
already.
metric space and the sparse coding is trivial. You end up with a population of cells that are active in the upper layer, which is your input, and you have a population of cells that are active in the lower layer, which is your location, and all you have to do is one dissociation.
It's trivial if you already know what kind of space you're representing. But
I don't think it makes no difference. It's just, well, they have to match, but once,
but as you
Is this an unsupervised learning process?
yeah.
And so similar things will end up having similar representations in this new space, right? That's kind of what this training objective
Yeah,
is.
so
is you change things slowly, it's going to move slowly in that new space, even though in the original space it could move drastically.
Yeah.
Right, so it's learning another space which contains some notion of similarity in this case 4 dimensions instead of the 200-dimensional pixel input or whatever it was. Right? So in that sense, it's kind of like the analog of a Cohonan map. For example, Cohonan maps learn a 2D similarity space from any arbitrary sets of inputs where there's that like neighboring things are similar. They learn to map it into a 2D space, and you could do Cohonan maps in higher dimensions too, but it'll enforce an n-dimensional similarity space from all these arbitrary inputs that are coming in.
Could I ask?
That's kind of the analog
That
of what they're doing.
sounds about right. Yeah.
Could I ask why the requirement of a straight line as opposed to a continuous curve? As opposed, what's the need for a straight line?
So what they want to do is they want a cortical column to they call it untangling the manifolds. They want it's like if you start at the lowest level of visual input, if you start at the pixel space, if you want to perform object recognition, there are good figures for this. You can't just recognize you can't classify objects just from the pixel input because the manifolds are hopelessly entangled, and the principle they want to make use of is at each successive level of the visual ventral stream, they're making it where a given object's the manifold of representations that it covers becomes less and less tangled. It becomes more and more flat. It becomes more and more separated. And
so they only need topological separability. They don't necessarily need straight. They don't necessarily. They need continuity, and they need a certain type of simply connected-ish thing on that manifold. But that's why that straight kind of stuck in my mind.
So they want it to be okay. They're choosing that they're betting on making the space flat being beneficial, and the thing they focus on is yes, the separability, but also once you put something into this metric space, into this Euclidean space, you get all these opportunities for generalizing.
Okay, so minimal geodesic, I think, is what they're actually going for, and a straight line happens to be the minimal geodesic in a two-dimensional space.
Yeah, the way they phrase it is they're minimizing the second derivative.
Can I erase something here to draw? You left no room for.
Yeah, I guess.
How about the stuff on the left here? Because that seems pretty.
Sure, yeah, it can go.
Because this seems to be their stuff. This is more sort of general background.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
We're also past the hour, by the way.
Oh, okay.
Right, not yet, almost past the hour. But not.
Should I say the last of my?
Oh, I thought you were done.
Oh, I haven't said this part yet.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So they're learning rules of trying to make their learning rule of they want it, if you think about the sensory input causing a bump of activity to move across this, they want it to tend to be straight. Not always straight, but like the overall tendency is for it to be straight. Something like that would learn about 3D locations and orientations. And then I brought in the stapler example. It would learn that if stapler's open and closed, that would correspond to the bump to moving in some other direction in that space. I'm injecting also, they didn't say this, but this learning rule would account for distortions in the grid cell code, how they don't form like a perfect, nice grid, especially when the room is shaped in certain ways that causes the animal's path to not be straight. Grid distortions would be explained by a rule like this, because they want the bump to tend to move in straight paths. If the animal's in an environment where it tends to move in curved paths, then you would expect the grid to be distorted because the bump wants to move straight. The animal's curving, therefore the grid's going to be curved as well. This learning rule seems general across all sorts of things. Them in V1 and up in entorhinal cortex with actual grid cells. That was, it feels like there is a general, there's a nice principle for general principle for cortical processing at multiple levels. And maybe they've gotten it, maybe they're onto something when they talk about successive manifold flattening, which is words I've only used in the past 5 minutes, but that's kind of how that's why they drew a picture like this.
Would that be contrary to the 1,000 brains theory that every column is learning complete models of objects? Is that the idea that you still need a hierarchy to figure these things out, or can I learn a complete representation locally?
They're not a close fit yet. I need to.
So they're incompatible in that regard. This is fine. I just want to understand that.
They're not closely compatible for sure.
That would I call incompatible.
But you're saying this is another way that our location code could be created?
Yeah. And yeah, another way it could be created, and just as step back to 30 minutes ago, this is still really interesting to me, that single bumps.
So that was the most interesting thing I've gotten out of this today. So
the other point I wanted to make is just hey, there are other people pointing to wanting to have this metric or Euclidean output of every cortical column, and it feels like there's something. Understanding why their motivations for landing on that theory.
It's funny. I told you earlier that right after we did the CLA paper, I went and talked to Bruno about this idea, and he wasn't very interested in it. So I'm not sure why he wasn't very interested now, but he's interested in it now. So that's.
But did they mention cortical columns specifically?
No, but they're talking about
hierarchical levels.
But they're talking about V1, what is happening in V1, they're in the cortical circuit, processing a single visual patch. They don't use the word cortical column.
Are they arguing that what's happening here is happening everywhere in the cortex?
Yeah, they don't make quite that broad of a claim. They talk about each level of the visual ventral stream is doing that.
Okay, well, all right, fine. We just go one step further and said, let's assume it's everywhere.
Yeah, and they never said anything about grid cells. I was pointing out that there's a parallel here. We represent Euclidean spaces. Their thing looks grid-like. I'm intrigued.
So I want to talk more further about this. If we're out of time, we can end this thing and then we just do it later. What do you want to do?
We've got 5 minutes.
I mean, we'll call this your topic. There, we have another hour.
So look, here's the basic theory, and I think I want to solve some problems in our basic theory, and there maybe is a solution here. The basic theory is you have some sort of input to a column, and you want to represent it somehow. You can think of that as like place cells. It's a coding that represents the input that's unique to some places in the world. You have another thing which is, so this is going to be sensory derived or input derived. Let's call it input because it doesn't have to be sense. It's just be an input. But for a lot of the cortex, we think of it as sensory input. And then you have a location in a metric space down here. So this is like equivalent place cells. This is like something like grid cells, and this is going to be updated by movement. And then we do this associative learning between this metric space, which is totally independent of what the input is. Of course, the input could then invoke a space, but the movement command does not care what you're sensing. Your movement comes in, you move here to a new location. And this input drives this, and it doesn't tell you where you are. You can only tell you where you are by associative learning to this thing. That's our basic idea. There's a ton of stuff we don't know about this. We do not know. We've assumed that this is some sort of grid cell representation down here, but we don't really have an understanding of how it's represented. The current thinking is it takes multiple of these grid cell modules, and we somehow combine them together, but there's the evidence of that is kind of fuzzy. We're doing those all within a column, which is very small. So there's this question of how does this metric space come about? I know the properties it needs to have. I mentioned them earlier, but how is it derived? We don't know that. Similarly, we don't really know all the details about how this input's encoded. We have a spatial pooler today, which is pretty simple. But even just yesterday, I was talking about how or Monday, I was talking about how it doesn't really map into what we see in the cortex completely. So there's a lot of mysteries here, but this is the basic idea. To me, the thing, and everything we know about grid cells is they're kind of complex and messy. As you point out, they're not always linear. They move and they get distorted and so on. We need something that's not distorted. So, and we also know, as you point out, there's many different types of cells in the entorhinal cortex that are interplaying and working together in orientation and different configurations. So I think what I got out of today, maybe not what you presented, maybe it is, but what I got out of today is that potentially the way to understand this is that there is a set of simpler basics functions, which I'm going to call those things over there. And these guys are like mini grid cells. They're like little mini grid. These are like sort of a different population of grid cells, and they combine to form our location, right? Before we were thinking as the grid cells themselves are the basis, and we did multiple grid cell modules. This says, no, I need multiple of those modules, which are kind of grid-like, but not really grid-like, right? They're sort of one-dimensional. If I think about it, they're like one-dimensional grid cells of certain repeating properties or something like that. So there's some basis function here. And in that case, the movement command goes into these guys. And what we see as grid cells is not really being driven by movement. These guys are being driven by movement, and they combine in a way that looks grid-like. And we end up with a one bump in a two-dimensional. This is literally a two-dimensional sheet of cells in the cortex. This is always going to be two-dimensional. The underlying space is going to be n-dimensional. We don't know what that is.
Just one thing to say though, we have no actual need for this 2D bump to exist.
I'm just saying it's observed. It's what Tank sees, right?
Okay, so you're talking about those grids. Okay. I see. You're not saying what I thought you were.
All I'm saying is, people measure grid cells and they say, "Oh, these grid cells have repeated these points." And Tank measures
as.
Well, you're pointing out an alternate representation here. I thought that you were saying, grid cells really aren't. They're messy. They get distorted.
Right. So I'm saying those grid cells, the ones the Tank is recording, are maybe these ones, and they're working with the other cells in entorhinal cortex.
The one that when you and Merkel worked on that paper, I was really hoping the elegant solution for how representation comes about is you have a whole series of one-dimensional grid cell modules, if you will. One-dimensional grid cell modules. They just parcel out space somehow, and if you had a bunch of one-dimensional grid cell modules, they could figure out any n-dimensional space. And so as the classic grid cells as originally seen by the Mosers is this two-dimensional bump that moves around two-dimensional space, and we were trying to make that work and to create an n-dimensional space. But it's much more elegant if I had a bunch of one-dimensional things. So maybe I misinterpreted that, but I said, oh, those could be like our one-dimensional simple modules or something. I don't know if I'm pointing this out. Okay. The only point I'm getting at here is we don't understand how this encoding comes about. We don't really understand it deeply. There's a lot of mysteries about that. We also have mysteries about this. But the basic principle, I think, is right, and maybe I'm sticking with it for now. And so maybe this paper gives us some new insights about how it is that actually this encoding comes about and how it is that this encoding comes about. But my arguments during your presentation here is that these really are two separate worlds. This has to exist independent of this, and this has to exist independent of that. And only by associative learning do we then start learning what structure is, an object is in the world, or some structure in the world. That's how I was approaching your talk here. Whether it's right or wrong, I don't know, but that's how I was approaching it. And it seemed like what you were focusing on a lot here, talking about these things, is you're figuring out an encoding up here that made sense. That was more metric-like in these dimensions. So maybe there's a point of taking this input, which is a complex. Input to this thing, we don't really know what the dimensionality of it is. So it gets learned, and we don't know how to represent it. So it's some sort of competitive spatial pooling type of thing. It gets learned, but maybe it's learning in a very specific way that is you were talking about, where you want these certain properties in here, and then we have something similar going down here, but it's based on movement. I'm just trying to express my confusions about what was just presented, and how I might hope to get something out of this is we need to have a better understanding of how this gets generated and updated to represent any kind of space whatsoever. We probably need a better understanding how this gets represented. So today we have a very simple idea here. We have the spatial pooler, and down here we have basically sort of a sum of multiple grid cell modules idea. And we don't even understand orientation in this either. So maybe there's some details in here which help us get a better understanding of this than that. That's how I heard what you said, and I'm not sure it's worth going into more now. Maybe, is that a hard paper to read?
Yeah, I mean, it's not written for you.
Is it a mathy paper?
Yeah, pretty.
Yeah.
Here, better would be, Bruno's talk was good.
The one at the Simons.
Yeah. That was.
I can't remember. You thought I didn't see that one?
No, I don't think.
It's funny because he and I sat together during that. We sat in the back room for a while, talked for a while.
Okay.
And we talked about what we're presenting. I'm not sure why I wouldn't have seen his talk.
So in your diagram, we have movement. Is that the thing being fed into 1D basis functions?
Well, that was the new idea today, right? And typically, when you think about a grid cell, the idea is that grid cells have a bump, and that bump moves in a two-dimensional surface,
right?
Based on movement.
I'm just trying to figure out how one-dimensional basis cells are able to encode movement.
They can.
It's just they're in some movements will move these in. Imagine I have some n-dimensional space, or think of it three-dimensional, and as I move, some of these will be aligned with the movement, some will be not aligned with the movement. So some of these will update, some will be updated a little, some won't update at all.
You're projecting a high-dimensional vector into multiple.
Okay, so there's a high-dimensional input going into these. A linear array of basis functions.
Yeah.
Okay, that I understand.
And the other question is, here's another fundamental question we've never really answered. We think about space as 2D or 3D. We've written a paper about how these grid cells could represent ND, but we don't know. Like take the kind of Nescu. How do you pronounce it? Let me get that. The bird thing.
Yeah.
Constanescu.
Mostly,
right. Sorry for those who care. We don't know if the cortex can actually end up flexible enough that it really is not restricted to the number that, in the end, will it learn the correct number of dimensions in the space? Or is it always kind of drop? Is it going to say, no, this is an evolutionary algorithm that was designed around three-dimensional worlds, or 3 dimensions plus time, and everything has to fit into that?
And this rule would work with arbitrary dimensions, the way they do it.
Yeah. I mean, I like that. I would rather it be that way, because we know that if I'm learning about democracy, I'm not sure how many dimensions there should be. And we need to figure that out. So the evolution argument would say, hey, probably figured out to work in 3D, and that's what it's tuned to. But the elegance argument would say, no, it would be great if the cortex figured out the dimensionality of everything and could represent any dimensional space. And it will discover that dimensionality through this interaction, which is another thing, is how does it discover the dimensionality, which it has to do. I mean, I'm just trying to interpret what you said and just trying to put it back a little bit more in our language. That's it.
So I think maybe what makes this most confusing is that they don't have any notion of motor. They don't have any notion of a given motor action is always going to move this a fixed amount. Repeating that motor action is going to move it a fixed amount. They don't have anything like that. They have just a generic metric space that's ready to have inputs mapped into it. How you can learn inputs, map it into it in any way you want. I think part of what has confused the conversation is that they don't have any notion of motor, and I think that.
Here's another. These are really fuzzy ideas in my head. So, what's appealing about this is that somehow you've taken some input space, which is like a sensory input space, and you've divided up into pieces which should move linearly with movement. They should move linearly with movement. And then we have these mini columns going across here all the time. And each mini column represents like a Bohr filter plus the cells have certain directional sensitivity to them and so on. So there's this somehow a promise or a sort of a hint of possibility that defining your input in a space like this, which itself is not metric in the sense of location on an object, it's just metric in terms of these individual components of the input, somehow could lead to the correct dimensionality and mapping down here. Like somehow by extracting out these 4 components of the input and saying those 4 components behave linearly through movements, but they don't tell me where I am, they just behave linearly through movements, that somehow that could define the dimensionality down here. Remember there was this idea I always had that each mini column could be a 1D dimensional space. It was like, I was really intrigued when you're working on the paper with Mirko about maybe each mini column would be a 1D basis function. And I gave up on that because I just couldn't get it to work, or there's something wrong with it, I can't remember.
I mean, that could fit with something like this.
I mean, that's a really elegant idea, that you have each mini column is a 1D dimensional space, and somehow the input space learns to, somehow they work together to solve this whole problem. I don't know how to say it beyond that. So if that fit with that, then I really like that. Then the mini column itself becomes the basis function for movement, somehow they work together. It's just, the mini columns span these 2 things. So anyway, that's a really intriguing idea.
Does that mean you tangle up topology with dimensionality?
The topology of the physical cortex?
Yeah. If you're talking about mini columns as dimensional vectors in some way.
Well, I guess just like I was arguing on Monday, I was arguing that mini columns are in this perfect position to define another form of communications. It's not a synaptic communications. It's a physical communications across layers.
Uh-huh.
And it's also very intriguing that we see these mini columns sort of parse up the space in some way, in a uniform way, and we see that as representations going back down here. So it's almost like saying, oh, I'm going to find a dimension such as orientation that moves linearly up here, and somehow that's going to map into, this is all very hand-wavy, map into a sort of a 1D grid cell location that moves linearly down here. It's all very fuzzy. I don't understand that. I'm just pointing out that it would be great if we had a bunch of 1D basis functions for 1D grid cells, and that somehow the input space itself decides how to combine these into some n-dimensional space here. That almost seems like it has to be right, even though I can't even express it. It seems like that almost has to be right somehow. So this is very intriguing, what you presented here today. I may have to try to read that paper, and maybe you can help me if I get stuck.
Subtai's analogy to Cohen maps, kind of rings true for this thing, because then you don't care, you have n dimensionalities going to these maps, and they can all, overlie on the same set of grid cells, but, route to different things or have different properties. But I mean, it's self-learned, it's self-association, if you're looking for a mechanism that says, how do I associate this with this, pitch, touch, texture, location, color, and whatnot. I mean, those are all dimensions, and somehow we can find unique associations against those simultaneously and uniquely. I mean, we can isolate them, I can hear the pitch
Would
independently.
the Cajon maps just be up here? I mean, my understanding, it's been a long time since I read Cajon's papers. I mean, we're talking 35 years or something like that. And I don't recall them having any, it seemed to me it was all about collapsing dimensions of input space onto something. It had nothing to do with movement or location in physical space, is that right?
That's correct, but in the sense that if there was a distortion to your space, you could, the Cajon map could be trained to undistort it, if I'm not mistaken, or it can represent it into a parameter space that has certain properties, either geometric or topological. I mean, the main thing is that it is more or less, it's a continuous space, it's a parameter mapping space.
Yeah.
So,
But-
I mean, you have this fact that you've got this two-dimensional sheet of cortical columns,
Yeah.
and you're trying to impute all this capability on it. And if you allow for the fact that in general you would like to have associations, trigger and then wire together, that provides a mechanism for that, I think. It also provides.
That's still just mapping n dimensions onto this, right? It's not.
I don't know.
I think so. I think Cajon didn't have any concept at all of this kind of metric space down here. He was, I think, if I recall, it's really been a long time, that he was really just talking about how you take an n-dimensional input space and map it onto, represent it in a two-dimensional plane of activity or something like that.
Well, it could, but then that serves as to drive, another mechanism down below.
But no, it can't. This can't drive this. It can only be associated with this.
Well, excuse me, but I mean
But
connected in some way.
So if there, okay, I wish I knew more about this. But you're talking about a 2D plane. You're mapping everything to different points on a 2D plane. So the 2D plane is down here, and the mapping is in the association.
I don't see that. No, I don't see that. You're mapping these inputs, these sensory inputs. We talked about these different types of sensory inputs onto a 2D plane.
I just don't know why you're pointing up here when you say 2D plane.
Because this is also a 2D plane. This is a 2D plane, and this is a 2D plane.
Well, that's fine.
But this 2D plane has to have these metric qualities. The ones I talked about earlier. Component maps don't do that. A component map doesn't tell you anything about where you are. All it can tell you is, hey, if I'm moving, maybe things are moving continuously here, but they don't tell me where I am. There's no encoding of location there.
Well, there's a coding of adjacency, or can
Yeah, but
be.
that's not what I need down here. I don't need just adjacency. I need to be able to figure out how to get from the library to the Starbucks, even though I've never been that way before. That's not adjacency. That's literally having a 2D map of the world and being able to say, I know what location I'll be if I move in this direction. Or I can calculate how to get to this direction from this point to this point. I need that. That's a key part of the whole cortex. And that's what people have written about how grid cells can do that. That was the people have been talking about. We know we have to solve this problem. So that's not the same as just adjacency up here. Adjacency down here doesn't get you that. If this was all things were adjacent but it was distorted, I can't calculate how to get from point A to point B. I just can't do it. The only way you can't do that. I can't, if everything's wobbly down here, it doesn't work.
Okay, let's hypothesize that you have the adjacency and then you would like to learn metric from that. In other words,
The point is I don't want to learn metric. I need to inherently know metric. I need to be able to say, I don't know how, okay, I'll just keep going, but I can't see how you can learn metricity, if you want to call it that. It has to be, the beautiful thing about grid cells is the way grid cells are described today, it's an inherent property of the grid cells. That's what you want. You want the space to have an inherent ability so that I can create a whole new map of a new object, and I don't have to learn anything. The spaces work. It's all, I don't have to learn how to learn the navigation of every new object. I want to be able to say, it comes inherently. I'm sorry for interrupting, Kevin, but
well, to me, I see if you have a topological space where the adjacency is embedded, and then you have a transformation for that to where you've undistorted it, where whatever the driving function is to say, okay, these things are topologically near, but I have some other reason to believe that, you know, I need to displace them a little bit further apart because the stimuli come bop, bop, and even though they're adjacent, you know, they should be represented down here as something that, you know, is.
Well, you're saying I have a distorted location map, and then I have a non-distorted location map.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's I mean, in the same sense that when something bad happens to your visual field, and you learn how to kind of map around that thing, you know, to get to try to minimize the distortion. I mean, even though we have a sense of place,
I don't think that's equivalent, but anyway.
well, I'm using it as an analogy, not necessarily how it actually happens, but the point of it is that we need the capability of being able to undistort stuff for whatever reasons that we.
Okay, grid cells on their own, the way they're described in the literature today, they don't need to be undistorted. They're undistorted to begin with. Now,
But how did they get that way?
that's a little bit of a mystery, but that's the whole premise of them. The whole premise of them is that that's the way they work. They're built that way. So there's multiple theories about how they do that. And no one knows for certain, but there are several theories about how they do that. We've discussed those here at length. But the idea is that it is not a learned thing. That's the whole point of having this separate metric space. Is that it's like you have this big blank sheet of paper which is divided into squares. It's all there. You just haven't learned what's in it yet. But you can navigate even though you don't know what's on it. That's kind of what grid cells do. I think the idea here is that I still love this idea that you can have a whole bunch of one-dimensional metric spaces, and that from that you can derive something that kind of looks like a two-dimensional, three-dimensional, n-dimensional metric space, but it's really, that could be more distorted and weird, where this one is, this is where all the perfectness is. I think we've gone over our time. We could talk about this more maybe another time. I'm only trying to respect the timing idea that we had, because I still want to talk about it. Maybe you and I, Marcus, could talk about what would be another thing to do here.
Okay,
Okay,
that sounds good.
okay. I know you guys all have things to do.
Okay,
Matt, tell us when we're off there.
thanks everybody for watching
Yeah.
the in the stream.